For 8 winters, Prince Kalen Thornvale pressed 2 fingers to his right ear like he was trying to hold himself together. For 8 winters, the halls of Iron Ridge pretended not to notice, because it's easier to name a tragedy than to solve it. For 8 winters, healers came in with warm hands and colder eyes, leaned close, watched the boys flinch, and gave the same verdict to King Ryden Blackmore, moon-touched. Marked. Beyond remedy. And for 8 winters, Ryden answered the only way a conqueror knows how, by waging war on silence itself. He emptied vaults. He summoned mystics from outlawed covens. He dragged bone readers across frozen borders and demanded a different answer. When they couldn't give him one, some of them didn't leave the fortress. Still, the prince did not howl. Still, he did not shift. Still, he kept touching that ear, like something inside it was alive. Then Naira Ashvale arrived, half-frozen and unclaimed, the kind of Omega Iron Ridge usually lets the snow finish off. She wasn't invited to look at princes. She wasn't allowed to stand near royal blood. But Naira had buried someone who made that exact gesture. And when torchlight struck Kalen's profile at the right angle, she saw it, deep in the shadow of his ear. A faint red glint that didn't belong to flesh. Naira understood in one breath what the healers wouldn't say out loud. This wasn't the moon's judgment. It was a weapon hidden where no one would dare search, and what Naira would pull out of the prince's silence was going to crack Iron Ridge open from the inside. If you like dark wolf court secrets, betrayals that wear loyal faces, stay close. And tell me, would you risk your life to save the child of the ruler who'd gladly crush you? Ryden Blackmore wasn't born into reverence. He forged it. The Iron Ridge Pax didn't bend the knee because they loved him, they bowed because they remembered what happened to those who didn't. Ryden's rule was the kind that turned whispers into prayers and prayers into silence. In his shadow, even seasoned warriors measured their breathing. They said his wolf was a night beast, massive, black as coal-veined stone, an alpha presence so heavy it made the air feel thinner. The kind of power that doesn't ask for loyalty. It takes it. And his fortress reflected him. Iron Ridge rose from the mountains like a clenched fist, cold towers, iron gates, stone archways that swallowed sound. Braziers burned along the outer court, flame licking upward, throwing restless light across carved pillars and wolf crests worn smooth by time. From the outside, it looked like protection. Inside, it felt like a vow you couldn't break. Corridors ran long and dim. Footsteps echoed too clearly. Servants kept their eyes down. Even laughter at feasts arrived cautiously, as if joy needed permission. The air carried smoke, steel, and something you couldn't scrub out with lie, fear that had learned the layout. In the middle of it all lived a boy who couldn't hear the world that feared him. A prince who never answered when his name was called. A child who sat beneath a torchlight, building little towers of stone and watching them fall, over and over, while his fingers returned to his ear like a secret habit he couldn't stop. And that is where our story truly begins. On the night an unmarked Omega named Naira Ashvale steps through Iron Ridge's gates with a healer's satchel at her hip, and notices the one detail everyone else has been trained not to see. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the chapter where everything unravels. Naira Ashvale stood very still with a bucket in her hands, the water inside it trembling from nothing more than her breath. The great hall was dressed for celebration, long tables, trenchers of roasted meat, flagons of spiced ale, braziers fed until the flames rose tall and proud. Wolves laughed in measured bursts, the way people laugh when they're watching the door at the same time. Music thumped from drums and strings at the far end, but Naira barely registered it. She was staring at the Alpha King's son. Prince Kalen Thornvale sat on the edge of the dais steps as if he didn't belong on the dais at all. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't laughing. His gaze wasn't chasing the movement of mouths the way some deaf children learn to do. He was simply there, like a pale stone dropped into a river of noise. And every few breaths, his right hand lifted. 2 fingers pressed behind the ridge of his ear. A tiny wince pinched his mouth. Then it eased, and he lowered his hand again. Once. Twice. Again. Most people didn't notice the gesture because they'd trained themselves not to notice anything the king couldn't fix. Silence was the prince's shame, and in Iron Ridge, you didn't stare at shame unless you wanted it to become yours. But Naira had spent years learning the shape of hidden harm. She had watched her little brother do the same thing, fingers to ear, small flinch, hollowed eyes, until the night he opened his mouth in a scream and nothing came out, not because he couldn't make sound, but because the thing inside him had eaten the part that could ask for help. She had buried him under frozen ground. She had sworn she would never miss that sign again. Torchlight shifted as servants moved, and for one heartbeat, the flames angled perfectly across Kalen's profile. A faint red glint sparked deep inside the shadow of his ear. Naira's skin went cold beneath her rough linen sleeves. Not blood. Not wax. Metal. Something shaped. Something placed. Her fingers tightened around the bucket handle until the iron bit her palm. A pulse of memory flashed, scorpion-curved talons, a hiss like burning hair, a talisman black as old bruises. No one else in the hall reacted. The nobles kept drinking. The warriors kept telling loud stories for the benefit of other men who needed to believe they were fearless. A healer in royal blue watched the prince with a careful, distant expression that looked like indifference, until Naira saw the healer's hand, hidden behind his cup, trembling. Naira's gaze snapped to him. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second. Then he looked away as if she was nothing. As if she was not carrying 1,000 unasked questions in her skull. As if she hadn't just seen something that could get her killed. Naira lowered her head and moved again, because Omega survived by becoming furniture. She scrubbed spilled ale, lifted platters, stepped around boots and trailing cloaks. She kept her eyes down. But the world had changed. The lie had shifted. It wasn't moon-cursed. It was someone did this. And in Iron Ridge, someone never meant a stranger. Not with gates thick enough to swallow siege engines. Not with guards who could smell fear. Not with a king who knew every loyal face and every trembling voice. A planted weapon meant betrayal wearing a familiar name. Naira's stomach tightened as she crossed behind the dais to replace a pitcher. Kalen's fingers rose to his ear again. This time the wince was sharper. His breath hitched. And when he lowered his hand, his fingertips were faintly stained, dark, almost rust-colored, as if something inside him had bled without spilling. Naira's mouth went dry. She forced herself to keep walking. Because if she moved too fast, if she looked too long, if she did anything that suggested the prince mattered to her, someone would notice. Someone always noticed when an Omega forgot her place. Iron Ridge did not forgive curiosity. Especially not in the shadow of the Alpha King. King Ryden Blackmore entered the hall like winter entering a room. Not with noise, there was plenty of noise already, but with weight. The laughter thinned. Conversation stumbled. Even the fire seemed to crouch lower in its braziers. He wore armor even at feasts, dark plates etched with old victories, the metal catching the torchlight like a blade held near skin. A wolf pelt, black, thick, almost too perfect, draped his shoulders. His beard was cut short, his hair pulled back, his eyes the color of river stone under ice. When he crossed the hall, heads bowed. Not all of them were respectful. Some of them were simply afraid of what would happen if they weren't. Naira did not look up. She could feel him without seeing him, the way you could feel a storm before it arrived. Raiden stopped near the dais. His gaze found his son. Kalen did not react. He didn't turn toward his father. He didn't straighten in pride. He didn't shrink. He simply stared at the stones in his hands, smooth river stones, carved edges from old ruins, arranging them in a small tower on the step beside him. Raiden's jaw tightened. It was the smallest reaction, but Naira caught it the way a desperate person catches a spark in a dark forest. His anger wasn't the hot, loud kind. It was contained. Polished. A blade kept sharp. The king said something, his mouth moved, and the hall went quieter to hear him. But Kalen's face didn't change. The king's words fell into the prince's silence like arrows into deep snow. Someone near the king chuckled in a nervous way, trying to smooth the moment. Another offered a toast. A third filled the space with a story about border raiders and a broken neck. Naira kept her head down, but her thoughts ran. 8 winters. 8 winters of this, a father speaking into a void, a court pretending the void was sacred, a child pressing his ear as if to keep himself from falling apart. A curse was a convenient story. A curse let everyone stop looking. Naira's throat tightened as she remembered her own arrival at Iron Ridge, half dead in a blizzard, the gate looming like a jaw. The guard who found her had been young, barely more than a boy. He'd looked down at her with suspicion, then seen the worn leather satchel at her hip, the stitching that marked it as a healer's kit. "Where's your pack, Mark?" he'd asked. Naira had laughed, and the sound had come out cracked. "Buried." He'd hesitated. The wind had howled. Behind him, the fortress torches burned. He'd opened the gate anyway. Not because she deserved mercy. Because she might be useful. That was how she'd survived her first day inside the Iron Ridge walls. Usefulness bought breath. Usefulness bought time. Usefulness bought invisibility if you did it quietly enough. Naira had done everything quietly. She had scrubbed blood from stones where wolves trained until their knuckles split. She had carried water until her shoulders burned. She had listened, always listened, to what people said when they thought an omega was just part of the floor. "Cursed, that boy," a servant woman whispered one night, shivering as she folded linens. "Moon took his hearing and his wolf." "Better him than us," another had replied. "Better the curse stay in the royal line." Naira had kept her eyes on the sheets, but her heart had thudded hard. "King's fault," someone else had murmured. "Moon punishing the conqueror." Hush. Silence. A look around the corridor as if Raiden's shadow had ears. Even the walls and Iron Ridge seemed afraid of repeating certain words. Naira learned the rhythm of fear quickly. Fear changed how people walked. Fear changed how they laughed. Fear changed what they were willing to see. And what they were willing not to see. After the feast, the hall emptied in a slow spill of bodies. Raiden left last, his warriors orbiting him like wolves around a blood scent. The prince was guided away by a tutor who spoke to him with exaggerated mouth movements, as if louder lips could bridge a deaf boy's world. Kalen followed obediently, but his fingers returned to his ear twice before he vanished down the corridor. Naira remained until the floor was scrubbed and the braziers were banked. She worked with other servants, hands raw from hot water and ash. No one spoke much. Night made everyone more careful. When she finally slipped away, she didn't return to her cot immediately. She walked the quieter corridors of the fortress, counting turns the way you counted exits in a burning building. Iron Ridge was a maze built to swallow intruders and keep prisoners from remembering the way out. She passed tapestries depicting battles, wolves tearing wolves, a king standing over kneeling alphas, crimson banners dripping in embroidered thread. She smelled smoke, iron, and old stone. She heard her own breath and the distant clank of a guard's boots. The prince's wing lay farther in, guarded by two men who did not smile. Naira did not approach. Not yet. Instead, she stopped at a narrow side passage that overlooked a training yard below. Moonlight turned the snow pale. A few warriors were still sparring, their movements sharp, controlled. At the edge of the yard, a small figure sat on a stone block alone. Kalen. He was bundled in a cloak too large for him. He watched the sparring not with envy, not with interest, but with the same distant expression he'd worn at the feast, as if he was watching a play performed in a language he didn't speak. Then his hand rose again. Two fingers pressed behind his right ear. Naira swallowed. She could not do this. She could not put herself in the path of royal blood. She could not draw attention. She could not risk the king's wrath. She should sleep. She should wake. She should scrub floors until she died. That was what rejected Omegas did in places like this. But the memory of her brother would not let her step away. She had learned the scorpion curse too late then. She had heard the story after the body was already cold, how a talisman could be slipped into an ear canal while a child slept, how it could root itself into the skull, feeding, suppressing, poisoning, killing without leaving marks anyone wanted to investigate. She had hunted the knowledge after. She had begged old women in hidden villages, traded her last silver for forbidden pages, memorized chants that tasted like ash in the mouth. She had sworn if she ever saw that gesture again, she would not look away. Kalen's fingers dropped. He blinked, slow. His shoulders sagged. Then, very abruptly, he slid sideways off the stone block and crumpled into the snow. Naira's heart slammed against her ribs. Guards on the far side of the yard didn't notice at first. The sparring continued. A laugh rose from a group by the weapons rack. Kalen didn't move. Naira's feet were already carrying her forward before her mind could decide. She slipped down the corridor stairs, into the cold, across the yard's shadow edge where torchlight didn't reach as strongly. She knelt beside him as if she belonged there. He was conscious, barely. His eyes were open, unfocused. His face was pale enough to look blue in the moonlight. His hand was clamped over his right ear so tightly his knuckles were white. Naira leaned closer. In the stillness, she could hear the faintest thing, like a tiny scratching, not from outside, but inside him. A whispering movement that made her stomach turn. Kalen's gaze found her. He didn't speak. Of course he didn't. But his eyes asked a question anyway, the way a drowning person's eyes ask a question when they grab your wrist. Naira forced her face into calm, the mask every healer wore so the sick didn't panic. She gently took his wrist. His grip fought her for a second, then loosened, trembling. Easy, she murmured, knowing he couldn't hear it, but needing the sound in her own mouth. She angled his head slightly to see the ear. Moonlight wasn't enough. She needed firelight. She needed a closer look. And she needed to do it without two guards noticing, and Omega crouched over the prince like a thief. Naira's gaze flicked up. A guard finally turned, frowning. He started walking toward them. Naira's pulse quickened. She weighed her options in a flash: lie, run, freeze. Then Kalen's body jerked, and a thin line of dark, too dark to be fresh blood, trickled from the edge of his ear. The guard saw it. "Prince," he barked, alarm exploding through his face. Everything moved at once. Another guard shouted. Warriors in the yard turned. Boots pounded snow. Naira stood with her hands visible, stepping back as if she hadn't touched him at all. A healer in blue rushed in, breath steaming in the cold. The healer knelt, peered at Kalen's ear, and Naira watched his face tighten, just a fraction, just long enough to confirm what she already suspected. He knew. He knew exactly what it was. And he was about to cover it up again. Naira's hands curled into fists inside her sleeves. Kalen groaned silently, eyes squeezed shut. The healer turned to the guards and gestured sharply, mouth forming words Naira couldn't hear from this distance but could understand by the shape of them. Carry him. Get him inside. Now. They lifted the prince and hurried him toward the fortress doors. Naira followed at a respectful distance, just another servant in the snow, invisible again. But her mind had stopped being obedient. Because she'd seen the blood. She'd seen the healer's expression. And she'd seen the red glint, unmistakable even in moonlight, buried in the prince's ear like a secret that wanted to stay hidden. Naira returned to her quarters later with shaking hands. She set her bucket down. She stared at her healer's satchel where it hung from a nail. Then she reached into it and pulled out a small silver probe wrapped in cloth, the metal dull with age. Not a tool meant for royalty. A tool meant for removing things that were never supposed to be there. Naira pressed the cloth to her lips, inhaling the faint scent of moonwater and old herbs. Her heart thudded once, hard. The prince wasn't cursed. The prince was being killed. And the fortress that feared the Alpha King more than it loved his son had helped the lie survive for 8 long winters. Naira sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the silver tool in her palm. If she acted, she would be executed, or worse. If she stayed silent, a child would die. And somewhere inside Iron Ridge, someone was counting on everyone continuing to look away. Naira closed her fingers around the probe. In the darkness, she made her decision. Because she had seen the glint. And glints didn't happen by accident. Sleep didn't come after that, not real sleep. Naira lay on her cot with her eyes open, listening to the fortress breathe. Iron Ridge had a sound of its own, the groan of timber in cold, the distant clank of patrol boots, the occasional bark of laughter from warriors who drank to forget what they'd done. Even silence here felt supervised, like a guard standing in the corner. Naira turned the silver probe in her hand until the metal warmed against her skin. It was a healer's tool, small, precise, meant for splinters and infected wounds. But she'd never used it for what she was about to attempt. Not on royal blood. Not under a conqueror's roof. The next morning, she became invisible again. She scrubbed stone floors until her fingers split. She hauled water through corridors lined with tapestries of battles, wolves tearing wolves, alphas kneeling in embroidered defeat, Ryden Blackmore painted larger than life, a shadow swallowing the lands behind him. She moved through servants' passages where Omegas kept their eyes down and their shoulders rounded, as if the world might strike them for standing tall. The Omegas policed themselves more fiercely than the guards. "Don't look up," whispered a thin Omega girl as Naira passed with a basket of linens. "Don't stare. Don't ask." "Why?" Naira had asked softly, because she already knew the answer and hated that she knew it. The girl's eyes flicked toward the corridor's end. "Because asking makes you noticed. In Iron Ridge, being noticed was how you died." Naira watched the fear move between them like a contagion. If one Omega laughed too loudly, another would flinch and hush them. If one lingered near the great hall doors, 3 others would tug her away. They weren't cruel. They were trained. Fear had taught them the rules better than any master. And the guards? The guards were loyal to Raiden, not to truth. Naira saw it in the way they listened for his footsteps, not for lies. In the way they snapped to attention for his shadow, but shrugged at whispered rumors. Truth didn't feed the fortress. Order did. Sometimes, in a corridor, Naira caught the royal healer in blue passing with his satchel and his guarded eyes. He never looked at her, except once, when he thought no one else was watching. His gaze slid over her face like a blade testing a throat. Then he looked away, as if she were dust. Naira's stomach twisted. He knew what she knew. And he was betting she would keep quiet. Because the kingdom's easiest lie was a holy one. She tried to bury the memory of her own pack, but it rose anyway, like smoke that seeped through cracks. Sometimes it came with a smell, wet pine, blood, burning fur. Sometimes it came as a flash of sound, her mother shouting, her father's wolf roaring, the sickening hush afterward when the invaders finished. Raiden's banners had been the last thing Naira saw before the flames took her home. Iron Ridge wolves, disciplined, merciless, moving through her village like they were harvesting something. She remembered hiding under a collapsed beam with her brother, Leo, his small body shaking against hers. She remembered whispering a promise into his hair, "I won't let them take you." She'd failed. Not that night. Not immediately. But later, when the scorpion talisman took him anyway, slowly, quietly, while the world called it illness and fate. Naira could still see his fingers pressing behind his ear. Still see the way his eyes begged her to understand what he couldn't explain. He'd died without sound. Naira had sworn she'd never be helpless again. Yet here she was, inside the Conqueror's fortress, wearing servant linen, surrounded by wolves who would tear her apart if she stepped out of line. And the child she meant to save? Kalen Thornvale was Raiden's son. The heir to everything that had burned her life down. Naira hated that fact the way you hated a thorn under the skin, constant, sharp, impossible to ignore. She also hated that the boy's eyes were gentle. That he sat alone. That he never once looked like a monster. The autumn feast returned in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The false normalcy. The braziers roaring, flames painting gold across steel armor and carved stone. The long tables heavy with meat and honeyed bread. Warriors throwing back ale like it could rinse blood from memory. Music loud enough to rattle cups. Naira remembered weaving between bodies with a pitcher in her hands, her gaze forced down, until the prince moved. Kalen had turned his head slightly, the torchlight angling across his profile. And there it was again. A pinpoint red glint inside his right ear, too deep to be jewelry, too sharp to be flesh. Naira's breath had stopped. Because she recognized the shape not with her eyes, but with her bones. A shadow scorpion talisman. Forbidden parasitic magic. Crafted from blackened metal and cursed thread, fed by a living host. The scorpion's tail hooked into the skull like a root, its claws drinking power, suppressing it, choking it until the body learned weakness as normal. It didn't just steal sound. It stole wolf. It kept a prince from shifting. Kept his instincts asleep. Kept his strength from waking, while slowly rotting him from the inside. This wasn't the moon goddess judging the bloodline. This was someone in Iron Ridge carefully murdering the heir, and letting the court worship the lie. Naira had seen the healer's trembling hand. The quick tightening of his jaw. The way he moved to cover Kalen's ear with his body when guards got too close. He hadn't been surprised. He'd been afraid. Afraid the wrong person would see. Afraid the truth would bite him. The moral crisis didn't arrive all at once. It stalked Naira over days like a wolf tracking scent. There were moments she wanted to let Kalen die. Not because he deserved it, because it would feel like balance. Because it would feel like the world finally paying her back for what it had taken. Ryden Blackmore had burned her home. His rule had made the North a land where Omegas learned to disappear. His name had been the last word on too many lips. Why should his bloodline be spared? But then Naira would see Kalen in the corridor, guided by tutors who spoke too slowly, too loudly with their faces. She would see him flinch from sudden motion. See his fingers rise to that ear again, the small wince that no one acknowledged. And she would remember Leo. And she would remember what it meant to be a child trapped in a body being eaten from the inside, while adults called it fate. Naira could not escape one truth. Kalen was innocent. Innocent didn't erase what Ryden had done. But it changed what Naira would become if she did nothing. On the 7th night after the feast, Naira stood in the washroom scrubbing blood from training cloths when she finally admitted it, out loud, under her breath, like a confession. If I let him die, she whispered, I'm not getting justice. I'm becoming the same kind of cruel. The water rippled from her shaking hands. Decision settled into her ribs like a stone. She would act. Even if it cost her life. She began preparing in secret. Naira's grandmother had taught her that curses were strongest when they convinced you they were inevitable. That magic fed on belief the way wolves fed on meat. But there were nights when the world itself weakened dark threads. Blood moons. When the moon rose red, the old tale said it thinned the veil between flesh and shadow. Some magic grew wild then. Other magic, especially parasitic curses, became vulnerable, exposed, hungry, easier to sever. Naira counted days by the fortress calendar carved into a stone pillar near the kitchens. When she saw the mark for the blood moon, her stomach tightened. 3 nights away. Time became a weapon pointed at her throat. She collected what she needed like a thief. A vial of moon water hidden behind the herb rack. A strip of blessed silver stolen from the healer's supplies when no one watched. Dried wolfsbane, not to poison, but to numb. Salt ground with ash from a sacred brazier. And her silver probe wrapped in clean cloth. At night, she murmured protective chants into her pillow so no one would hear. The words tasted old, sharp with grief and power. They weren't prayers. They were instructions to the world. On the 2nd day, the fortress shifted with sudden tension. Orders snapped down corridors. Armor clanked. Wolves moved with purpose. King Ryden was leaving. Naira watched from the servant passage as he mounted his warhorse in the outer court, his warriors forming a black ring around him. The air tightened with the scent of dominance, smoke, and cold iron. Wherever he was going, it mattered. And the fortress, without him, felt like a blade left unattended on a table, still sharp, still dangerous, but no longer held by the hand everyone feared most. Security thinned. Guards got sloppy at the edges. Some drank. Some argued. Some looked relieved, like they could breathe again. Naira did not feel relief. She felt a clock begin to tick. The blood moon rose on the third night like a wound opening in the sky. Even the wolves who didn't believe in old magic stared at it too long, unsettled by the way it stained stone and snow with red light. The fortress braziers burned brighter, as if trying to compete. Naira kept her head down, carrying linens through corridors that smelled faintly of storm. Kalen had been quiet all day. Quieter than usual. Pale. His fingers had hovered near his ear more often, his posture sagging like someone holding up a collapsing wall. By nightfall, he was barely walking. Naira saw him in the far corridor outside the old well, an indoor stone well that fed the fortress during sieges. 2 guards stood nearby, half distracted, watching the red moon through an arrow slit. Kalen moved like a sleepwalker. His hand clamped over his right ear so hard his elbow shook. He took one more step. Then his knees buckled. He hit the stone floor with a dull sound that echoed down the corridor. The guard spun, startled, swearing. One knelt beside him and shook his shoulder too roughly. "Prince, hey, Prince!" Kalen convulsed. Not a normal shiver. A full-body seizure, as if something inside him was trying to tear itself free. A faint dark mist, barely visible, curled from his ear and evaporated against the red light. Naira's blood iced. The talisman was reacting to the blood moon. Hungry. Panicked. Dangerous. The royal healer in blue was nowhere in sight. And Naira knew with a certainty that made her teeth ache, that if the wrong hands took Kalen now, they would treat him by pressing the curse deeper, hiding it again, buying time for the betrayal to finish its slow work. Naira stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I can carry him," she said, voice steady, as if she belonged. Both guards turned, eyes narrowing at the sight of an Omega daring to speak. "Get back," one snapped. "Go fetch the healer." "There isn't time," Naira said. Another convulsion rippled through Kalen. His head snapped to the side. Dark red fluid seeped from his ear, thin as ink. The guards hesitated. Their fear wasn't for Kalen. It was for what Raiden would do if his son died on their watch. Naira used that fear like a lever. "If he dies here," she said softly, "it will be on you. Let me move him. Now." The guard's jaw tightened. He nodded once, sharp, unwilling. "Fine. But if you—" Naira didn't wait for the threat to finish. She slid her arms under Kalen's shoulders and knees. He was light, too light for a prince of 8 winters. His body burned with feverish heat, then went cold in the next breath. His hand clawed at his ear, fingers slick with dark fluid. Naira carried him fast, not toward the healer's rooms, not toward the royal wing. Toward her own quarters. Toward secrecy. Toward treason. Her heart hammered as she moved through corridors, every footstep a risk. If anyone stopped her, if anyone asked questions, if anyone decided an Omega had no right. Kalen's body jerked again, and a hiss, no, not a sound, but a sensation, seemed to ripple the air around his head, as if the curse resented being moved. Naira didn't slow. She reached her door, shoved it open with her shoulder, and slipped inside. Then she locked it. Not with the simple latch, she shoved a chair beneath the handle, braced it against the stone wall, and whispered a warding line her grandmother had taught her, pressing salt into the cracks. The room was small. Bare. A cot, a wash-basin, a shelf with rags and herbs. It was not a place for princes. But it was a place no one watched closely. Naira laid Kalen on the cot and wiped the dark fluid from his cheek with a clean cloth. His eyelids fluttered. His lips parted in a soundless cry. The red light from the blood moon spilled through the narrow window like spilled wine. Naira pulled her satchel down from its nail with shaking hands. Silver probe. Moonwater. Blessed strip of metal. Salt and ash. Her throat tightened as she arranged them on the floor beside the cot like a ritual circle. Because the moment she began, there would be no undoing it. If she succeeded, she would expose a lie that held the fortress together. If she failed, she would kill the heir with her own hands. And if anyone found her mid-ritual, Ryden Blackmore would not ask questions before he tore her apart. Naira drew a slow breath. She pressed her fingers against Kalen's forehead, feeling the fever, the tremor beneath his skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though he could not hear it. "And I won't let you be buried the way my brother was." Kalen convulsed again, and a thread of dark mist curled from his ear like smoke from a dying fire. Naira uncorked the moonwater. The ritual began. There would be no going back now. Naira tipped the moonwater into a shallow bowl. The liquid caught the blood moonlight and turned the color of bruised silver. She dipped 2 fingers in it and traced a thin line from Kalen's temple to the hinge of his jaw, then down the curve of his throat, an old ward meant to keep shadow from fleeing into the body when you cut it loose. Kalen jerked beneath her touch. His lashes fluttered. His hand clawed toward his ear again, fingers slick with that dark red seep. "Hold still," Naira whispered, knowing it was useless, knowing she said it anyway because her own fear needed sound to cling to. She packed salt and ash into a small ring on the floor beside the cot. Inside it, she laid the blessed silver strip, the probe, and a thin needle she'd sharpened herself. The tools looked too small for what she was about to do. Too fragile. Kalen convulsed hard enough to rattle the cot frame. A thread of smoke-like darkness curled out of his ear and snapped back in, like something yanking on a chain. Naira's stomach turned. The talisman didn't want to be found. It didn't want to be removed. It had been feeding for 8 winters. It had learned the shape of his skull. It had grown comfortable. And comfort, in cursed things, became claws. Naira pressed her palm to Kalen's forehead, anchoring him. With her other hand, she lifted the probe. The first touch of silver against the edge of his ear made Kalen arch as if struck. His mouth opened in a soundless scream. Naira's vision blurred with memory, Leo's face, contorted, silent, helpless. Not again. She steadied her breath and forced her hands to be careful, precise. She tilted Kalen's head toward the window so the blood moonlight spilled into the hollow of his ear. The glint pulsed. Not like metal catching flame. Like a heartbeat. Naira slid the probe deeper. She expected resistance from flesh. What she felt was resistance from something that pushed back. A subtle thrum against the silver, alive, aware. Kalen's fingers dug into her wrist, surprisingly strong. His nails bit. His eyes were wide and wet, pleading. Naira met his gaze and held it like a promise. "I'm here," she whispered. "I see you." Then she moved the probe again. The scorpion talisman revealed itself in slivers, black metal curve, red-veined lines etched like tiny runes. It wasn't lodged, it was embedded. Thread-thin barbs hooked into tissue, roots braided into bone. It had grown into him. Naira swallowed bile. Removing it would not be gentle. She dipped the needle into moonwater and slid it along the talisman's edge, whispering the chant her grandmother used for severing rot from living wood. The words scratched her throat. They tasted like iron and grief. The talisman shuddered. The air in the room went colder. And then the pain hit Kalen like a wave. His back bowed. His teeth clenched so hard Naira feared they'd crack. His hands flailed, caught her sleeve, tore the fabric. Naira kept going. She used the blessed silver strip next, pressing it against the talisman's exposed curve. A thin hiss rose, not from Kalen, but from the thing itself. It didn't sound like a voice. It sounded like hot metal plunged into snow. Naira's skin prickled. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lean in, eager. The talisman fought. Darkness spilled out of Kalen's ear in a thin stream, writhing like smoke caught in wind. It coiled around Naira's fingers, cold and hungry, trying to climb her skin. Naira jerked back, slapped salt across her hand, and the smoke recoiled with a violent twitch. "Not me," she rasped. "Not tonight." Kalen convulsed again. The talisman pulsed, brighter, redder, like it knew time was running out under the blood moon's gaze. Naira changed her grip. She hooked the probe under the talisman's curve and pulled. Nothing. She pulled harder. A sharp crack sounded. Bone? No, not bone, something like hardened resin splitting. Kalen's whole body seized as if the curse had nerves that ran through him. Naira's hand shook. She could feel it now, roots. Multiple. Twined into the channel, laced behind the ear, buried deeper than any healer had dared look. "Come on," she whispered, voice breaking. "Come on." She poured moonwater directly into the ear. Kalen's eyes rolled back. His throat worked silently. His chest heaved. The talisman screamed. Not out loud. Inside Naira's skull. A piercing, insectal shriek that made her vision spark and her teeth ache. The air vibrated. The candle flame on her shelf guttered. Naira bit down on her own fear, braced her foot against the cot frame, and pulled with everything she had. The roots tore free. Kalen's body jerked so hard he nearly rolled off the cot. Blood, real blood now, bright under red moonlight, spattered Naira's fingers. The talisman came out in a single violent motion, slick and writhing, shaped exactly like a scorpion with a hooked tail and cruel little claws. It thrashed in the air as if it could still find purchase. Naira slammed it into the salt and ash ring. The scorpion talisman writhed, and then the blessed silver strip flared. The talisman ignited with white fire. It burned, not like wood, but like something that had never belonged in the world to begin with. The scream in Naira's skull rose to a final, furious peak. And then the scorpion collapsed into ash. Silence snapped back into place. For one heartbeat, the room held its breath. Kalen lay still, chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. His face was wet with sweat. Blood streaked his ear. His fingers twitched. Naira leaned over him, listening with her whole body for any sign of the curse returning. Nothing. Then Kalen's eyes flew open. He gasped. Not the shallow, silent gasp of before. A real sound tore from him, raw and startled. Air. Breath. Voice. The room filled with it, and Kalen's gaze went wild as if sound itself was an avalanche crashing over him, the crackle of a dying candle, the distant thump of boots in a corridor, Naira's own breath stuttering. He made another sound, a broken sob. Naira's eyes burned. Kalen lifted his hands and touched his own throat like he couldn't believe it belonged to him. He rasped, and the word shattered into a cough. Naira pressed a cloth to his bleeding ear, gentle now, hands trembling with relief. It's okay, she whispered. This time, he heard it. His eyes snapped to hers. He stared at her mouth, at her face, at the way her words formed and landed in the air. I can, he whispered, and then he laughed, small, disbelieving, half hysterical. I can hear. Naira couldn't speak. She only nodded, because if she opened her mouth she might start sobbing too, and she could not afford softness yet. Not an iron ridge. Not when the truth was about to rip the fortress open. Kalen's breathing steadied, and then his body tensed, different now. His eyes widened, not with pain but with something awakening under skin. Naira felt it like a pressure change in the room. Power, compressed, long-starved, uncoiling. Kalen's hands clenched. His bones shifted under his flesh with a soft, terrifying crackle. His pupils stretched, wolfish. Silver light flickered beneath his skin as if moonfire lived there. Naira stumbled back, instinct screaming. Kalen gasped once, sharply. And he shifted. Where a boy had been, a small wolf pup now stood on trembling legs, silver fur catching the blood moon glow like polished metal. His eyes were pale and bright, ancient in a way that didn't belong in an 8-year-old. He shook once, as if shaking off years of suppression. Then he looked at Naira. And in that look was recognition so clear it nearly knocked her over. Not blind gratitude. Not childish dependence. Something deeper, bond, instinct, truth. Kalen, no, the silver pup, stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Naira's knee. Naira's throat tightened. She sank to the floor beside him, slowly, carefully, and placed a hand on his fur. Warm. Real. Alive. You're here, she breathed. The pup's ears flicked. And Naira felt, not heard, a voice inside her mind, soft as a paw step. You pulled the lie out of me. Naira's eyes widened. You can speak like this? The pup blinked, and the sense came again, not words exactly, but meaning. I can feel what is true. Naira went cold. Truth sense. A rare gift whispered about in old stories, wolves touched by something older than crowns. Wolves who could taste lies in the air like smoke. Which meant the people who hid the scorpion had not only tried to kill the air. They had tried to prevent this power from ever waking. A sudden crash outside Naira's door made her flinch. Boots. Multiple. Running. Kalen's pup ears flattened, and he lifted his head toward the door, hackles rising. Naira's blood iced. Someone had noticed. The chair beneath the handle shuddered as something slammed into the door from the outside. Open up, a voice roared. In the king's name. Naira's mind raced. If she opened, they would see the blood, the ash, the silver pup. They would accuse her of witchcraft, treason, poisoning. They would kill her before she could speak. The door exploded inward. Wood splintered across the room like thrown knives. The chair snapped. Cold air poured in, carrying the scent of snow, steel, and fury. King Ryden Blackmore filled the doorway. He looked like a storm wearing armor, eyes blazing, beard rimed with frost, breath steaming. His warriors crowded behind him, hands on hilts, faces hard. Ryden's gaze snapped to the cot, to the blood on the cloth, to the ash ring on the floor. Then to the silver pup standing protectively in front of Naira. For a heartbeat, the king did not move. Then his voice shook the room. "What did you do?" Naira rose slowly, hands empty, palms visible. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. Kaelin shifted back before her eyes, bones reshaping, silver fur melting into skin. In a blink, the boy stood there again, pale and trembling, but upright. And he spoke. Clear. Loud. Real. "She saved me." The warriors froze. Ryden went rigid, as if the sound of his son's voice had struck him like a blade. Kaelin took a step forward, placing himself between his father and Naira. His small shoulders squared. "The curse was in my ear," he said, words stumbling but strong. "It wasn't the moon. It was something. A scorpion." Ryden's face twisted, rage, disbelief, something like terror. His eyes flicked to Naira again, and for a moment she saw not a conqueror, but a father confronting the idea that he'd been fighting the wrong enemy for 8 winters. Then the fortress did what it always did when truth threatened power. It tried to chain it. They dragged Naira into the great hall before dawn. The blood moon still hung low outside, bleeding its color through tall windows. Torches flared against stone. Wolves crowded in, murmuring like a storm. Naira's wrists were bound in iron. Not gentle rope, iron that bit skin and promised pain. "Execution," someone whispered behind her. Omega touched the air, another hissed. "Death." Naira kept her chin lifted, because fear had already taken enough from her. Kaelin stood beside the throne, wrapped in a cloak, his ear bandaged. He looked smaller than ever in the huge hall, until he spoke. "I can hear lies now," he said. The hall stilled. Ryden's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" Kaelin swallowed, then continued, voice trembling but steady. "When someone speaks and it isn't true, it sounds wrong. Like stones grinding." A murmur rippled through the gathered wolves, uneasy, disbelieving. The royal healer in blue stood near the front, hands clasped tightly. Naira watched him. He wouldn't meet Kaelin's gaze. Kaelin looked at him anyway. "You," Kaelin said softly. The healer flinched. Kaelin's eyes narrowed, the truth sense sharpening behind them. "You knew." The healer's mouth opened. No sound came out. Ryden's voice was low, lethal. "Healer." The man swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the side of the hall, toward a tall figure standing near the pillars. Lord Varric. Ryden's trusted second. The king's right hand. The wolf who smiled in battle and advised in war councils. Varric's face was calm. Too calm. Naira felt it before Kaelin spoke, the air shifting, the lie thickening. Kaelin turned his head slightly, as if listening to something beneath words. Then he pointed. Him, Kalen said. The hall seemed to inhale all at once. Derek's smile didn't move. My prince, he began, voice smooth as oil. You're confused. You've been ill. Kalen shook his head. That's a lie. The words fell like stones. Raiden took one slow step toward Varric. Explain. Derek's eyes flicked, just once, to the healer. The healer broke. He dropped to his knees with a choked sound. I was paid, he blurted. I was told to keep it hidden. To treat symptoms. To say it was the moon's judgment. By whom? Raiden's voice was quiet. The healer's shoulders shook. He squeezed his eyes shut. Lord Varric. Varric moved. Fast. Too fast for a man who claimed innocence. His hand flashed toward the healer's throat, kill the witness, end the confession. Raiden caught him. The Alpha King's grip closed around Varric's wrist like iron. For a heartbeat, they were still, two predators locked, power colliding. Then Varric snarled and lunged. The fight was brutal and short. Steel rang. Wolves shouted. Bodies surged back. Raiden moved like a war machine, precise, merciless. Derek fought like a cornered beast, eyes wild now that the mask had slipped. Naira saw it in Varric's face, the truth of him. He hadn't cursed the prince out of hatred. He'd done it for power. Because an heir who never shifted, never spoke, never heard, was an heir who could be replaced. And if the king broke under that grief? A second in command could become something more. Raiden drove Varric back with a savage strike, forcing him to his knees on the stone. Derek's breath came in ragged bursts. Blood dripped from his lip. You were my right hand, Raiden said, voice shaking with something darker than rage. You stood at my side. Derek laughed, hoarse, bitter. And you never once looked at your own house, king. You looked outward. You burned the world. You didn't notice the rot beside your throne. The words hit with cruel accuracy. Raiden's jaw clenched so hard his teeth bared. He could have killed Varric there. Everyone expected it. Instead, Raiden's gaze swept the hall, over the terrified nobles, the shaken guards, the Omegas pressed against walls like shadows. And he spoke a sentence that sounded like the end of an era. Exile. Gasps. Shock. Raiden leaned closer, ice cold as winter steel. Live with what you've done. Live without a pack. Live without a name. Derek's face twisted in fury. Guards dragged him away, his boots scraping stone, his curses swallowed by the hall's stunned silence. The fortress, so used to fearing Raiden's wrath, now feared something else. The truth. Later, when the hall emptied and the torches burned lower, Raiden faced Naira. She was still bound. Blood dried beneath her nails. Ash smudged her sleeves. Her heart felt hollow, scraped clean by the night. Raiden stood close enough that she could smell smoke on him, and beneath it, something raw, grief that had never found a voice. You had every reason to let him die, the king said. Naira met his gaze without flinching, because fear had already taken enough. I did, she said simply. But he is not you. The words landed hard. Raiden's face flickered, anger, then pain, then something like understanding. For the first time since Naira had entered Iron Ridge, the Alpha King looked tired. Not untouchable. Not carved from brutality. Just a man who had been ruling with his fists because he didn't know how else to hold anything. His gaze dropped, past her chains, to Kaelin standing behind her, listening, alive. Raiden's throat worked. Then, in a hall built on obedience, the king did something no one had ever seen. He knelt. Not to Nyra as a subject. Not to Kaelin as an heir. To the moment. To the truth that had been denied for 8 winters. Nyra's breath caught. Kaelin stepped forward and touched his father's shoulder, tentative. Raiden closed his eyes briefly, as if memorizing the feeling. When he rose, his voice was low, rough. Unchain her. A guard hesitated, then obeyed. Iron bit skin one last time and fell away. Nyra flexed her wrists, pain blooming, but beneath it was a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Space. Choice. Kaelin moved closer to her, his gaze steady. You saved me, he said, voice clearer now. I won't forget. Nyra nodded, because if she spoke, her voice might break. In the days that followed, Iron Ridge changed in small ways first, like frost melting from a window. Kaelin practiced sound like it was a new language. He sat near braziers and listened to fire crackle. He followed footsteps with his eyes, then laughed when he guessed right. He held for the first time on a cold morning in the outer yard, thin, wavering, imperfect. The fortress froze at the sound. Then, slowly, it answered. Not all at once. Not with joy. But with something like relief, like a throat unclenching. Nyra was no longer given only floors to scrub. She was called to the prince's chambers as healer, yes, but also as something harder to name. Witness. The one who had dared to question the lie. Sometimes Raiden watched them from a distance, silent, his expression unreadable. But the air around him shifted. The fear in corridors didn't vanish, not overnight. Yet it loosened. Because the greatest lie had been dragged into the light and burned. Nyra stood one evening at the fortress edge, watching the mountains under a clean moon, and she finally understood what the true curse had been. Not the scorpion talisman. Not the moon goddess. The curse was the silence everyone chose because it was safer than truth. The curse was fear dressed as loyalty. The curse was a kingdom that called betrayal fate so it wouldn't have to look at itself. And the most dangerous thing in Iron Ridge had never been the monster on the throne. It was the lie no one dared to question. Until a rejected Omega did. If this story caught your attention, subscribe so you don't miss the next tale.